Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And obviously, in the middle of R J Corman's facility, the appropriate place to start is with Rick Corman. Most of us in the room knew and loved Rick, and as I think about people I've known in my life who were really unique and important and significant, if I had to pick the top 5, Rick would be in it. Everywhere I would go in the country, anywhere near the railroad business, everybody knew Rick Corman. Everybody. Not only because of the extraordinary business that he built, but because of the extraordinary human being he was. And if I ever do my memoirs, I never have, but if I ever do them, I'm going to include in there what one of Rick's doctors said at the funeral when Rick told him he didn't think he was going to make it through to 2014. His doctor said, well, you've got to be there to vote for Mitch McConnell. So I appreciate the chance to be back here, this fabulous business that Rick built and all of you have helped grow and expand, and I hear that it's doing very well. What I'd like to do today is to give you my take on the condition of the country, also a few observations about the challenges in the Middle East that we're facing now, and then I'll throw it open for a few questions. You all already know that I'm not ambivalent about my feelings about the Obama years. I think they've been very bad for the country. If you look at how they were able to dominate the landscape, it was a result, of course, of having a very good election. In 2008, the president and his allies had a 40-seat majority after the election in the House. They had 60 votes in the Senate. For those of you who are not political junkies, 51 is a majority, but 60 gives you real control because a lot of the things we do in the Senate require 2/3 supermajority as opposed to a simple majority. So they really could do whatever they wanted to, and they did. The $1 trillion stimulus, Obamacare, Dodd-Frank, if you're not in the financial services business, this is what I call Obamacare for banks. An army of regulators crawling all over every business in America, and of course the most conspicuous example of that we have in Kentucky is the war on coal, which has led to 7,000 coal mining jobs lost in eastern Kentucky over the last 6 years. For every mining job you lose, 3 more jobs. And don't feel too comfortable when you say, well, Jessamine County's not a coal county. We're all for many years have enjoyed some of the lowest utility rates in the country as a result of 90% of our electricity being generated by coal-fired plants supplied largely by Kentucky coal. And it's been one of the ways we've been able to compete with other states for jobs. Location, we're a great location within 500 miles of 2/3 of the population, and low utility rates. So that's in the process of going away. Been a tough 6 years, not only for the country, but particularly for Kentucky. Now, we have a new element that I want to touch on today because of the timeliness of it, and that is the rise of ISIS or ISIL, depending upon which term you want to use, in the Middle East. Described by most of our defense and foreign policy experts as the most serious threat ever, more so than even Al-Qaeda, because they actually control a large swath of land and have the potential to hit us here at home. So I know your first reaction after 2 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq is, oh my goodness, we don't want to get anywhere near that part of the world. Well, that would be, I suppose, a luxury we could afford if they were only a threat to the people in that region and not to us. We've been down this path before. We all remember 9/11, and of course, there's a tendency, I think, for these things to fade as we move further and further away from them. But this is the new 21st century threat. We saw it on full display on 9/11, but it makes you almost yearn for the Cold War. At least in the Cold War, you had more traditional adversaries. They were countries. And usually when you have an adversary that's another country, you settle a dispute in one of a number of different ways. One way is you have a war. Somebody wins and somebody loses, and the POWs go home, and there's a brokered peace treaty, and you move on. That was the more traditional thing. During the Cold War period, frequently we were fighting proxy wars with the Russians, disputes around the world where we supported one side and they supported the other. But fundamentally, the disputes were driven by differences among countries. Now you have the biggest threat of the 21st century. We have decent relationships, with the possible exception of the Russians, decent relationships with almost every country in the world. The new threat here are these radical extremists who basically want to kill people. And among the people they want to kill are us. So, how did we get into this position? Don't misunderstand me, I'm not blaming all of this on the president, but I do think he's made a number of fundamental mistakes that I would like to recite in how we got to where we are. If you recall, the hallmark of the Obama foreign policy was laid out in a speech in Cairo back in 2009. It was publicized as a speech to the Muslim world by the new president of the United States, indicating we were going to go and we're going to try to do things differently. And the fundamental takeaway from the president's speech was two things. Number one, he seemed to question American exceptionalism and basically argue that we are all just everybody's just sort of alike. There's nothing unusual or exceptional about America. And number two, if we just talk to each other more, things would get better. In other words, you need to have more conversation and interaction. So here we are 6 years later, and let me just take you around the world and think about how things might have been different. The first big decision, I think, was the decision opposed by the military leadership to leave no residual presence behind in Iraq. Now, whether you felt like the Iraq War was the good war or the bad war, as the president did, he felt the Iraq War was the bad war and the Afghan War was the good war. No matter how you felt about that, the Iraq War, by the time the president came to office, was essentially won. And what we have done frequently in the end of these conflicts in the past, as you know, is left some deployment of American personnel behind. We did it in Germany, we did it in Japan, we did it in South Korea, all of which had a pretty good result. And it allowed that kind of stabilizing U.S. presence to give these fledgling countries a chance to become more productive and normal. The president, however, I think felt very strongly that ending the Iraq War meant also leaving the area. No one can guarantee that what's happened since then, would not have happened, but I think there's a good chance that it might not have happened. In Syria, 3 years ago, we saw the turmoil develop in Syria. Early in the Syrian conflict, everyone believed Assad would fall. We chose not to support, not with troops, but with arms and training and that kind of thing, chose not to support the group that had a chance to topple Assad. Now it looks like he's pretty much going to consolidate at least part of the country, and the rest of the country is in the hands of this ISIS group, as these terrorists came coming in from other countries and developed into quite a lethal force of about 15,000. Also, in the Israel-Hamas conflict, the most recent one, we spent seemingly an endless amount of time trying to kind of push the Israelis into making a deal that honestly they couldn't live with, as if there was some kind of moral equivalence between Israel and Hamas. Hamas, by the way, is a terrorist organization which happens to control Gaza. but it is a terrorist organization. They're not too interested in negotiations. Now, I always say to my Israeli friends, the only people that get worse press than the Israelis are the Republicans. And so every time Israel gets into one of these conflicts, everybody in the world beats them up. But I think the Prime Minister of Israel put it pretty correctly when he said this. He said, Israel uses missile defense to protect its civilians. Hamas uses its civilians to protect its missiles. There is no moral equivalence, my friends, none whatsoever, between the Israelis and Hamas. No moral equivalence at all. The Israelis, in fact, as you know, would leaflet, call, and communicate in advance with any areas they intended to hit in the hopes that the civilians would leave. And of course, Hamas would make the civilians stay and then complain about civilians being collateral damage. So there's no moral equivalency there. And I think the better approach for us would have been to stick with our friends, the Israelis. They are a Western-oriented, democratic country, which significantly distinguishes them from their neighbors. And also, with regard to the ongoing Palestinian dispute, they have to live with it. You know, there's an old saying that the parties to the dispute ought to be the parties to the settlement. In other words, if you got to live with the problem, you ought to be the principal one deciding what you can live with. I think that didn't work out too well. And then there's the Iranian nuclear issue. We've been involved in these extended discussions, which is a good thing. And the sanctions that were imposed on the Iranians was a result of legislation that we passed that the president, frankly, was not interested in having, but we gave it to him, and to his credit, he did a good job of imposing these sanctions and bringing the Iranians to the table. The Iranians, though, look around at all of this, and the message they get is if we can just keep on talking, it'll be just fine. And so, on a bipartisan basis, we suggested an additional piece of legislation that would have said the following. At the end of the period for talks, if nothing happens, you get tougher sanctions. In other words, some consequence to attach to an endless discussion game designed to thwart the sanctions. The President in his State of the Union in January threatened to veto the bill. And so here we are, the sanctions period for discussion ended in July, and of course the administration extended the discussion period, and we're talking endlessly. So let's say you're Vladimir Putin and you're looking at all this, and you think the single biggest geopolitical mistake of the previous century was the breakup of the Soviet Union. And you envy for empire again, and you're watching all of this, and I think your conclusion is the president loves to talk. So I think I'll take Crimea. And he did. And I think I'll pressure eastern Ukraine, and they are. And our response, so far, and remember, the Ukrainians gave up the ultimate trump card. The trump card is nuclear capability. That's why you can't mess with the North Koreans. That's why we're so concerned about Pakistan. You get the drift. If you get in the nuclear club, nobody messes with you. So, the Ukrainians at the end of the Cold War voluntarily gave up their nuclear weapons that were located in the Ukraine part of the Soviet Union in return for territorial guarantees. I think they're probably thinking they made a really bad deal. Because believe me, if they had been in the nuclear club, nobody would be messing with them. So you've got a Ukrainian military that's not terribly large, and but are willing to push back against these Russian incursions into eastern Ukraine, and so far we've offered them meals ready to eat. If any of you have been in the military, that's MREs, and not exactly a serious effort to help them help themselves. In none of these instances that I've cited are we talking about the reinsertion of American combat troops, but there are a number of ways in which you can influence things if you're the United States of America short of that. So I think the president now at this point, this will shock you when I say it, at this point is doing the right thing. I mean, I think we do need to use our air power to back up our Kurdish friends and to try to pressure the Iraq government into getting its act together again, which is always a challenge for them. But we are where we are. And I can't guarantee you none of this would have happened if we had been in a more traditional American mode with regard to foreign policy and defense, but I think it had been a better situation indeed. And so we now confront, in addition to all of our domestic challenges, a serious international concern. The president, I think, needs to come up with a strategy. My guess is it's going to require some congressional support, and if it's what I think it is, I'm very likely to be supportive because I think the fundamental goal after 9/11 was to make sure these people couldn't hit us again here in America. That's fundamentally what we decided on a very large bipartisan basis after 9/11 was that if somebody's going to get killed here, we'd rather be over there than here. And so I still think that makes sense. I know those wars were long. I know a lot of, as in all lengthy wars, the longer they go on, the more unpopular they get. But at least you could say this, at the end of the Iraq War, it was a stable situation. I hope the president will leave a residual force behind in Afghanistan. The military leadership has recommended once again that there be a kind of residual force there, not for combat purposes, but for training and for counterterrorism. In fact, the military leadership feels so strongly about it that the incoming commandant of the Marine Corps, the new commandant coming in, appointed by the president at his confirmation hearing, publicly differed with the president's decision to take everybody out. So it'll be interesting to see if the president's willing to reconsider that given what's happened in Iraq. Because, no matter how you felt about either of these wars, we lost folks, people were seriously injured, costly both in terms of personnel and in finances. We don't want to just squander the sacrifice, waste the sacrifice that was made over the years. So those are some of my thoughts about where we are. Let me dwell on coal for a minute. Make no mistake about it, this administration wants to shut down the coal business. What is this mission about? It is about global carbon emissions. Global carbon emissions. I choose not to even get into the debate about whether that is a global issue that needs to be addressed, but if it's a global problem and if it needs to be addressed, one country is not going to fix the problem. The Indians and the Chinese are building coal-fired plants. The Europeans are now importing coal, the Europeans, where all of this carbon emission concern started. And you might have noticed about a month ago, the Australians repealed their carbon tax. They'd gone out and done that for a couple of years, seen what it did to their economy and said, whoops, the price is too big. So even if you believe global carbon emissions are a huge problem, your country doing it by itself is going to have no impact. It's about like dropping a pebble in the ocean. For us, it's all pain, and if you believe in the mission, there's no gain. And so southeast of us, we have a depression. 7,000 coal mining jobs lost during the Obama years. For every coal mining job, you lose 3 more. It needs to stop. The effort to do this legislatively was defeated in the first 2 years of the Obama administration when they had a 40-seat majority in the House and 60 votes in the Senate. In other words, when they owned the place politically, they couldn't get this through. So now the president is going to try to do by executive fiat what he couldn't get through Congress when his party totally dominated the scene. And so people are upset about it. In the Senate, we can't get votes. Senator Paul and I have been trying to get votes to see where people stand on this issue. The majority leader of the Senate will not allow any votes, which leads me to my final point before taking your questions. Look, every senator has a vote, but one senator is in a more significant place, and that is the majority leader of the Senate. The majority leader of the Senate determines what the agenda is in the Senate, what we're going to vote on, what we're going to take up, what we're going to debate. And under this particular majority leader, who is frequently not allowed any votes on anything, he has even kept us from getting votes. So you can't even find out where people stand. It's been so severe. To show you how different this is, the Senate used to be, under both Democrats and Republicans, a freewheeling place with lots of amendments and lots of votes. When we were in the majority, I used to tell our colleagues, look, the price of being in the majority is the minority gets their votes. They're going to make you walk the plank, but if you're afraid of voting, you ought to go into another line of work. That's what we do here in the legislature. We offer ideas and we vote. Not under this guy. We looked at the last year. These statistics will astonish you. My party had in the Senate 9 roll call votes in a year. The Democrats in the Senate had 7 roll call votes in a year. In a whole year. We found one member of the minority in the House of Representatives, not the majority, in the minority in the House of Representatives, who'd had more roll call votes on her proposals than the Senate Republicans and Democrats together. One member of a 435 member House. Now, of what relevance is that? Well, we don't know where people stand. I have a feeling that there's pretty broad opposition to what EPA is doing based upon the fact that when my friends on the other side had huge majorities, huge, they couldn't pass it. Tells me there's a lot of opposition to what EPA is doing, not just among Republicans, but among Democrats, which is, of course, obviously why we're not getting a chance to vote. So there's a chance the American people may give us a new majority. If you're a sports fan, you know that it's easier to score on offense. I've enjoyed being the defensive coordinator, but I'd like to have a chance to be the offensive coordinator. And that could happen this fall. In fact, many people think it's likely to happen. Now, what difference does that make to our state? If you have a guy from Kentucky setting the agenda in the Senate, not only for America, but looking out for Kentucky's interests, versus the current leader of the Senate, a guy from Nevada, who says coal makes you sick. That's how he feels about coal. It makes an enormous difference if you want to go in a different direction as a country. And of course, from a Kentucky point of view, it makes a particular difference. We've only had one other Kentucky senator who's been the leader of one of the parties in the Senate, Alvin Barkley, who was the leader of the Democrats in the 30s and 40s. Now, my opponent is a new face, and I will grant you that. But I think an appropriate question for you to ask yourself is, a new face to do what? To do what? A new face for no change. A new face for the status quo. A new face to vote for the president's agenda. A new face to make Harry Reid the leader of the Senate. So curiously enough, even though I've been there a while, if you want to change things, if you're unhappy with where we are as a country, the candidate for change in this race is the guy you're looking at. Because change is not just about how long you've been there, it's what your views are, what you think we ought to be doing. And if you're satisfied with where America and Kentucky stand under this administration, then maybe voting for her makes sense. But if you think we can do better, it's time to go in a different direction. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to throw it open here for a few minutes. Anybody? Yeah, yes, sir.
Not a question. It's more of a thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
My nephew actually lived in the Crimea.
Oh, he does.
And he's married to a Ukrainian. When the rebels took over, or Russia took over the Crimea, they were threatened, and so they had to abandon everything and move to Kiev. I called your staff. He would like to move back to the United States, but his wife is still a Ukrainian citizen, and your staff has been helping with the State Department and trying to get him out of the Ukraine back to the United States. And I think what's most significant is he'll probably move to Idaho, so he's not even your constituent, and there's still hope.
Let me try to repeat some of that. I bet you all couldn't hear a lot of it. You have a relative who lives in Crimea, and he managed to get out, but his wife is still there? Is that what you're...
No, they're both still in Kiev right now.
They're both moved to Kiev when the Russians took over Crimea.
Well, it was a very fast move.
A very fast move, he says. And my office has been trying to help them. Well, thank you for bringing that up. Well, that puts a face on what we're talking about here. And I appreciate your bringing that up. I wish them well. I hope we're able to be helpful. Yes, sir.
Speaking of Russia and Crimea,
Put it close to your...
the Vladimir Putin probably isn't going to slow down in his kind of aggression and looking for opportunities. I believe part of the reason that Europe hasn't been able to respond is they're concerned about their energy supply.
Absolutely.
And so one of the opportunities that we could have is to help them in that regard. And I'm wondering if part of some of the president's what he's looking at is increasing our production, and maybe we could consider some of our extra Kentucky coal.
Yeah, well, the Europeans are importing more coal. The Europeans are importing more coal. The Russians, after the Fukushima nuclear disaster, the Germans, after the Fukushima nuclear disaster, decided to go in a completely different direction. And concluded, apparently, without nuclear, they needed coal. And of course, you're right, the hammerlock the Russians have on a lot of European countries is the natural gas situation. It's a good argument, not only for exporting coal, but a good argument for exporting LNG, liquefied natural gas, which we've also had difficulty doing. As a result of hydraulic fracking and horizontal drilling, we're going to be energy independent in oil and gas within a few years. Our country is already the #1 natural gas producer in the world. We're going to need coal too. And we're in the middle of an energy boom in oil and gas, and yet we've got this pressure over here on coal, which we have learned to burn cleaner and cleaner over the years. The CO2 issue is sort of a separate issue from the normal emission concerns we have about burning coal, all of which has gotten better over the years. What's so frustrating about this whole CO2 crusade is it's going to have no impact at all, even if you thought this was a huge problem. No impact, because other countries are not going to tie their hands behind their backs. So it's ultimately exasperating, and I think that's why Senator Reid is not going to allow votes on this, because I think he thinks it'll pass. I think he believes a lot of his members share the views of people like Senator Paul and myself, that this is a crusade that has no chance of succeeding, even if you thought this was a serious threat to the globe. So we're in the middle of an energy boom in this country, and I'd love to see coal be a part of it rather than being discriminated against. I mean, there are 2 EPA regulations. The first one sets up a standard that technology cannot meet. So that basically guarantees no new coal plants built. The second one, which came out in June, is targeting existing coal plants. The mission here is pretty clear. This is not subtle. And the president, when he ran for office the first time, was pretty candid about it. I mean, I have to give him credit for it. I don't think he's in doubt about what they're up to. And the only way we can stop it, the only way we can begin to stop it that's available in 2014 is to change the majority in the Senate. There's nothing else we can do this year. Those are the only elections that we have. And so if we want to begin to turn in a different direction, this is the only thing we can do this year.
Senator, I just wanted to thank you for helping my friend go out under running her daughter back after she was kidnapped 2.5 years ago.
Thank you. I appreciate it very much.
Senator, you mentioned, I think, that the ISIS represents a greater threat to our country than Al-Qaeda, and that this force of 15,000, I think that's the number you used, is a real threat to this country, attacking the city. And I think you also said that there are some points, some actions that our president has taken that you particularly agree with
I do.
at this stage. I'm curious if you would share with us a little bit more as to one, why you think ISIS is a greater threat than Al-Qaeda. And secondly, what additional steps you would take, or you president, to confront, to prevent an ISIS attack against the United States.
Yeah, I'm quoting the Secretary of Defense when I say they're a bigger threat than Al-Qaeda, so I'm assuming he knows what he's talking about. And Senator Hagel, former Senator Hagel, who's Secretary of Defense, was very much against the Iraq War, very much in favor of downsizing the military. This is a guy who was fully, even though he was a Republican, he was very much against the war and very much in favor of downsizing the military. And that's why the President made him Secretary of Defense. But he's the one who gave the assessment of ISIS. I think the reason he gave that assessment is that they actually control territory, actually control large swaths of territory. And apparently, according to the experts, seems to have some pretty good sense of command and control of their operation. So with regard to what I would do beyond what the President's doing right now, I think the President, I believe what he's going to do is come up with a plan that goes presumably beyond what we're going to do now. And the message I wanted to leave with you and others is I'm open to supporting that, because I think passivity at this point is not a good policy. And I think he's edging in the direction of dealing with the threat. And regretfully, there's nobody else that has the leadership potential or the sophistication militarily to lead this than us. Now, I think ultimately people on the ground who live there are going to have to want to take them on. And I think the Kurds are certainly willing to do that, and they've been strong allies of ours. So I think what the President's going to do, and the message I want to leave is I'm open to supporting him. I support what he's doing now. I'm not very fond of what he did earlier, but I'm supportive of what he's doing now. And I think he's going to make a recommendation for further assistance that may well require our voting on it, and if I think it makes sense, I'll be voting for it. Okay, this is going to be the last, I'm told.
Senator McConnell, I'm passionate. One of the cool things I get to do in any given year is officiate a ton of weddings. And young Americans in the past 5 years, maybe even a little before, don't seem to have the kind of buying power that, say, my parents had or I had. My father and father-in-law starting off in life, their take-home pay was about 98.5% of their gross income. Their first home was roughly 3 times that amount. These young couples often have a lot of student debt, and he'll have some, she'll have some, and they're often in jobs that are about $10 an hour or less. What could Congress do to help young Americans starting out?
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. The two groups of people that have made out the worst over the last 6 years have been the middle class. You know, the President always talks about the 1%. Let me just say this about the 1%. They've been doing great. They've been doing great. You know, that was the market. The 1%'s been doing great. The people that haven't are the middle class, and I'll get to young people in a minute. The middle class, who are about $3,000 per year behind where they were when he came to office. So all the borrowing and the spending and the taxing and the regulating is not producing a vibrant enough economy to keep moving up. Now, with regard to young people, age 18 to 30, that was the strongest group of supporters for the president, and I can't think of any other group that's done worse than the people who supported him the most. Whether it's student loan debt, whether it's lack of jobs and moving back in with mom and dad, any way you look at it, 18 to 30-year-olds who supported the president overwhelmingly have done very poorly. The answer to this is really not complicated. A growing economy solves these problems. We need to do exactly the opposite of what we've been doing. Less spending, less borrowing, less taxing, less regulating. Look what happened as a result of this onslaught of all of those things, the spending, the borrowing, the taxing, and the regulating, is this was the slowest recovery after a deep recession since World War II. Normally the pattern's been the deeper the recession, the quicker the bounce back. Not this time. So I think everything we did prolonged the situation. So we're in a pattern of slow growth. And you've noticed the unemployment figure going down. I hope you know why. It's because of the size. It's what my wife, who was Secretary of Labor during the Bush years, as you may recall, explained to me. Unemployment is based on the labor participation rate. That is the number of people looking. If we had the same labor participation rate today that we did when the president took office, we'd probably be up at double-digit unemployment because a lot of people just given up and dropped out. So nothing will work like getting the economy going. And I think if the private sector saw the government doing things that led in the direction I'm talking about with regard to taxes and regulations, pro-growth. I mean, look at the people that have been put on the NLRB, for example. These anti-private sector people riddled all through the federal government, making it difficult for businesses to grow and expand. We need to have a pro-business country. What's wrong with having a pro-business country? You know, we now have the highest corporate tax rate in the world. In the world, everybody else is competing. It's the global economy. We need to lower that corporate tax rate, become a competitive country again, and I think that is what stimulates the economy and gets the growth coming back. It also benefits the government itself because it gets more revenue. When more people are working, obviously the government gets more revenue. So honestly, my view is we've had a tutorial here over the last 6 years in what not to do, and exactly the wrong thing to do. And I hope the American people will either change the president's mind about it, because he's going to be there for a couple more years. Maybe he can have an epiphany here, or change the Senate and begin to move the country in a different direction. Thank you all so much for the opportunity to be here. I don't know which door people are going to go out. Over that way? I'm going to get over there and hopefully see you all on the way out. Thanks again. Appreciate the opportunity to be here.